So a very warm welcome to this learning forum and this really important and interesting topic about spirituality and mindfulness. And I'd like to really welcome two of, I nearly said the grandfathers, but perhaps that's a bit rude, but two of the people who have been in this sphere of mindfulness in South Africa for a long time. Simon Whitesman, as you know, was a founder of UMISA, and he's a senior teacher and a medical psychotherapist. And Pete Milligan, who is a psychiatrist working in northern KZN. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Janine. Hello, everybody. Pete, I can't remember, were you going to start or was I going to start? I know you did send a message earlier. No.
You're doing well, Simon. Continue, please.
Thank you. I must say, I was a little chuckling inside myself when Janine says, you know, you can just change your identity in the little box. Would that it was so simple, but in a way, it's a wonderful kind of analogy for this conversation. You just need to change your identity, change that to that, and then everything's sorted. So, so Pete's going to frame the conversation, but we thought maybe just to drop into 5 minutes of practice to gather our energies as a collective of what Thomas Hubble refers to as co-presencing. It's a beautiful word, co-presencing, where we practice with and for and through each other without ever being restricted to our own practice. So in whatever way feels natural and comfortable for you, can either close your eyes if that's what's feeling most natural, or let your eyes fall into a soft gaze away from the screen, or on the screen if you prefer. And simply rest in the obviousness that you hear. Even if there's an awareness that the mind is traveling other domains and territories, there's an unmistakable sense that I'm here. And without over-efforting or efforting at all to realize this, simply recognizing both the immediacy and the obviousness of this knowing. And it might be helpful to direct your attention more specifically to the planes of contact with the feet and the ground, the seat and the chair or the cushion. As a touch point into groundedness. I know what Barbara likes to call the earth element of our practice, where we're in contact with the earth, with the ground. But just taking a few moments to settle in with the contact with earth, with ground, with chair, with cushion, with body. You might already have a felt sense of the breath moving in the midground or the foreground. But it's not essential. You might simply sit in this knowing of the body in contact with the ground and the chair. Can you perhaps sense the physical boundaries of this body. The skin in contact with the clothes, the air moving across the skin, which is exposed in the hands and the face, the head, back of the neck. So while there is no doubt a lot going on the inside of the body, heart and mind, sensing the thin layer of sensation that is now in your awareness on the edges of the body, the periphery, the skin. And being curious if it's possible to invite awareness or explore an awareness which is also knowing not only of sensations on the perimeter of the body, but just beyond, around the body. In front of the body, above the body, and behind the body. Can you rest in a simple knowing of the felt sense behind the body? And just for a moment, experimenting with bringing awareness to the front of the face, or the face, front of the head, and the sensations in the face. And then the sensations behind the head, in the back of the head. And just like pendulating or like a pendulum's awareness of the sensations in the face, the back of the head, in front of the body, behind the body. Without answering the question, dropping in the question, where is this awareness that knows located? Where is this awareness that knows located? And as and when you feel ready to, if your eyes aren't already open, inviting them to open gently with a soft gaze.
Thank you, Simon. And good evening to you all, and welcome to today's session. In this session, we'll be exploring aspects of mindfulness and spirituality. And this session will focus on issues or questions that may arise in teaching mindfulness. So whether you're teaching in a group format in MBSR or another MBI, or on an individual basis, participants will often come up with questions or concerns related to their own spiritual tradition or beliefs. So, for example, they may have particular misperceptions about meditation. They may be concerns that meditation is somehow emptying the mind, or perhaps even allowing other things to enter, which may be harmful or even sometimes perceived as demonic. Participants frequently have concerns about the origins of mindfulness arising from the Eastern traditions and Buddhism, and will often raise these early on in the teaching. So in this evening session, Simon and I will be exploring some of these concerns and thinking about how we can sensitively and skillfully negotiate some of the questions raised by participants. And in addition to this, we'll also be discussing some useful frameworks to use in thinking about these issues. So let me begin, Simon, by asking what your approach would be to someone entering an MBI training or perhaps an individual consultation who says to you that I'm wary of meditation, or perhaps it's against my belief or my spiritual tradition. I'm afraid that it might empty my mind or open me up to other influences.
And what do I say in those delicate moments? Yeah, that's a great question. I don't wish, but it would be nice to be able to offer a lovely linear answer. Like a good doctor, I'll say it depends. One of the favorite responses of any doctor is like when you ask them occasion, it depends. And it's actually really useful in certain conditions and situations is to, I guess, to approach each individual or collective context on its own terms. And that is a rather vast range. So I'd be quite delighted, I just say, as you are, if you ask me that question, if you were coming to me individually or you were in a group and there was that level of forthrightness and an expression of a concern, which would then allow like a direct turning towards and say, well, it would be, what is the concern? And maybe do a little bit of inquiry about what the concern is. You know, as you said, they tend, and it would be interesting to hear other people's impressions, that tend to be fairly recurring themes of concern. So I don't know if you want me to address all of them or some of them, Pete, in response to that question.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Simon, just pragmatically for participants, it perhaps also depends on the setting. So one might approach this differently in a group setting as to how one would approach it in an individual session or in a one-on-one. So perhaps if you could comment on how you might pick this up in a group-based setting, perhaps in an MBI versus an individual setting.
Yeah, I think that the group setting I would say is probably a little bit more challenging because of the range of experience, perceptions, and beliefs. And so one person might represent that or embody that in the particular, a concern, say, about emptiness or Eastern traditions, if they come from a traditional religious background, whereas many others, it would either they atheist or it wouldn't bother them in the slightest. So the concern that I would hold is to keep the coherence of the group. What would be skillful that didn't alienate if I went down one avenue and alienated 70% of the rest of the group. So I think the group, and it's the nature of groups, is that each person brings their own complexity, and then the group itself has its own identity. So I guess if it was early on in a program, and people were concerned about mindfulness in let's say, as an Eastern religion, and it wasn't appropriate to do an inquiry given it was a group process or it was early on, I would orientate to the pragmatics, the science, the clinical application, and refer to the contemporary nature of mindfulness as a tool and as a vehicle for self-regulation and self-care. So I would kind of gently orientate the conversation, not away as an aversion to, but as a way of protecting the coherence of the group, or honoring the coherence of the group, emphasize those elements. If there was an insistence, I would be honest. I'd say honesty is an underutilized quality. And to create to acknowledge, even honor the link that mindfulness is a very strong root, and I never use the ism here, in the teachings of the original Buddha, who was a human being, and he taught about the human condition, and his teachings were about what is the nature of the human condition and how can we help individuals and groups to live more quality lives. And so I would remove the languaging that of alienation, which ism tends to do, the hyphen isms, and then expand that to say, and some of those elements are now moved into a contemporary environment where, again, then I would link in the strong research element, and say, which has been shown in any number of ways through science and through qualitative studies, to help people deal more effectively, skillfully, and compassionately with their lives. And then I would generalize the question, or generalize the approach to, I'm sure everybody would agree that life can be really, really difficult in the particular and in the general, and whatever skillful means that we can bring to help us, that mindfulness is one of them. I would then kind of probably what I would thread in is that the only way to really know if this is going to be helpful is to take one small step and to experiment that for yourself, and ditch it if it doesn't work from you. So really embody that quality of permissioning people to not want to explore it further, and embody the quality of acceptance that it's not for everybody. So wherever possible, and we see and I'm sure that we'll pick up a lot of these threads in this and forward conversations, the implicit and explicit potential for alienation is very high. And so to be able to acknowledge that and hold it subtly on the inside, and try to, it's almost like martial arts, where you kind of absorb the energy and gently deflect it in another direction, without the person feeling that they're coming up against a hard edge. So I think that's skillful. I mean, and people often come back and say, no, but it's like, I know it's Eastern and it doesn't work for me. And then the honesty is it's containing, because people don't want to be bullshitted. And that is alienating, to kind of, I'm so busy trying to be nice that I'm actually not being truthful. Yeah, so that would address some of those elements. And how would you do it, Pete? How have you done it, and how would you approach that particular challenge?
Thanks, Simon. I think I mean, two things I would add to that. I think one thing that is helpful is to normalize it, to reflect perhaps that these are questions that come up regularly, because they do. And so one's not the first person to have asked that question or such a question. So just to say, this regularly comes up in MBSR or in these contexts. And I think what you said is really helpful. I think perhaps one other thing one can do, particularly if one is encountering significant resistance, is to offer an opportunity for a one-on-one at some point, or an opportunity after the group to touch base or to just discuss things further. I think it's important for the safety of the individual and the group not to dig too deep, especially because this often comes up early in session 1 or very early in the program. And I think it's vital that we don't alienate participants by digging too deep or perhaps pushing them inadvertently into a corner around their belief systems. And I particularly liked what you said about the self-regulation focus, and maybe that takes us to thinking a little bit about one of the frameworks, and one of the frameworks that I found very helpful early on. And I remember us sitting around in our reading group years ago talking about Shauna Shapiro's work. And she has a very simple framework. She says, most of us come to mindfulness training because we're looking for self-regulation. That's where we begin, as you said. So we come to this because we're anxious or distressed or stressed or maybe depressed. As we begin to engage with the practice, we begin to open up to the next level, which is really the level of self-awareness. So awareness of the body, awareness of the mind, etc. And then it's inevitable that we move further into the third level, which she describes as the level of self-transcendence. And I found it really helpful to think about this in terms of that simple framework. It's often as participants start to move into greater self-awareness and certainly self-transcendence that they begin to soften, but also their own beliefs begin to soften. They begin to feel less certain, or perhaps simply are seen as just thoughts. And this can be quite scary, I think, for those that are coming from a more strict religious tradition, but in a way is inevitable. But I like the way you begin with pointing people to self-regulation, because that feels, I think, pretty safe in most traditions. I think once we start talking about things like self-transcendence, it does become a more scary place for people with more fundamental beliefs.
It's a scary place for anybody, in my experience. Yeah. I'm curious about the word that you used here. You think, you say it's inevitable that, the self-regulation becomes self-awareness, becomes self-transcendent. And I'm just wondering, do you think it is inevitable? Like, is it an inevitable progression, or is it a potential progression? I wonder.
I think it's a potential progression, but I think all participants who engage meaningfully in the practice start on that road, begin down that track.
Yeah.
So, in the course of an 8-week MBI or MBSR, they're going to move forward along that road, and I think that is inevitable. So, again, I think that one can make people comfortable around beginning around self-regulation, but they will begin to soften and move forward.
Yeah, I suppose that the self-regulation expanding rather than a progression, as like eddy or like circles which expand outward. Let's start to embrace more. So self-regulation, say, following the breath would be self-regulatory, or moving the body in a particular way with yoga or with walking would be self-regulatory. Noticing that the mind tends to wander is both, and then returning it to an anchor, say in the body, as the first foundation of mindfulness, is both self-regulatory and self-awareness generating. Maybe that's expansion, which for me, what has always been really curious, and it remains an enormous curiosity and probably an unanswerable one, is why do some people expand further than others, both within an 8-week MBI and beyond? we're talking about just the people who get into an environment where they're even considering learning mindfulness, let alone all the many who would have never even heard of it. So there is this expansion. And some people, it really resonates, and there's a kind of almost invisible momentum or interest or engagement, which for some really is strong. For some, it's kind of, I guess it's a Gaussian distribution of motivation. But that transition, I think, is one of the most interesting and sensitive and potentially transformative elements, is when self-regulation expands into self-awareness. There's an awareness that I live in a body. I don't live on top of a body. I would say that's one of the kind of foundational insights of the dawning of self-awareness, which can take 30 years to really get. And so that sense, I'm inhabiting a body which is alive with feeling and sensation and energy. And I have a mind which I took to be myself. I have a thinking mind, I say, which I've never even known that there was anything other than that, thoughts and thinking. And so that for me is the second center of gravity of that shift from self-regulated. And it's happening all the while. Without the self-regulation, that self-awareness is not possible. In coming back to the breath, I have to first notice that I've been lost in thought. That I've been actually, as we now with more experienced practitioners here, when we talk about being lost in thought, what we actually mean is I'm identified with thought, and we call that thinking. So my identity becomes the thinker. With this very subtle but profound in its own way knowing of thoughts, as you say, Pete. Then that wedge of space that was always there becomes identified with, and that becomes this knowing, oh, I've been lost in thought, but now I know that I've been lost in thought. That's the second center of gravity, the knowing of the mind as more than just thought, moving through it. I think almost everybody, if not, I can't see exactly, I can only see on my one screen, but everybody who's sitting in front of me, I know, knows exactly what I'm talking about, because we've had years of experience and experimentation of that. And even then, I mean, I certainly have been practicing for quite some time. It still amazes me how easily and frequently I become identified and caught in this fog of thinking. It's almost like this space opens up, or I drop beneath it, or it's like, oh, there's something else here. So that is a very interesting, those two elements in an MBI. If you just, people often say, what do you get out of an MBI? I say those two elements, that I inhabit a body and that I'm not my thoughts, are the kind of epicenter and foundation of self-awareness, which have the potential, if there's enough momentum, again, who knows why, it would be more with some rather than others, to examine and explore what that even means, because I'm curious to know what you mean and how you understand, Pete, self-transcendence. So, we're going full circle here, but maybe just reflect on, I don't know if you want to go straight into what you understand by self-transcendent, that third of Shapiro's arc or progression.
I want, before we go there, Simon, I just want to stay with the self-awareness for a moment in relation to religion or spirituality, because of course what begins to happen in the process is that my beliefs, my religious beliefs, begin to be seen as just thoughts. And that, of course, is a profound shift. So just a thought. And so there's a loosening in relation to those thoughts or beliefs that, again, I think is inevitable in the practice. And so even at the level of self-awareness, for a religious person, there's a shift. there's a sense of holding ideas or beliefs more lightly, and beginning to notice the movement of thought, and even the movement of belief in the process. And I find that, again, I don't want to use the word inevitable too much, but I find that that's central to the process. And I think there's an inevitable softening that happens in relation to firmly held ideas, whether they're religious beliefs or dietary ideas or whatever else we hold firmly to. And so that's an important part of the process, an important part of this conversation, I think.
Yeah, I wonder again about the inevitability of this. It requires a certain persistence with the practice, I think. I might come screeching up against my deeply held conviction about the need to not eat gluten. Let's take it away from religion and spirituality. And I'm like, and I start seeing that thought as a thought. And I was like, no, but I'm the head of the Gluten-Free Association. And it becomes a threat not to my identity, potentially, and how I'm seen and accepted by a group with whom I'm affiliated. So I'm so grateful that you're raising it in this particular space, because at each layer of this kind of emerging self-awareness is a resistance, potentially, and a fear and an uncertainty, a kind of being undone in some way, becoming undone, and and often it's imperceptible until it becomes perceptible, and it's like, oh my goodness. The holding of that with a lot of sensitivity based on our own undoneness or being undoneness, I think, is the hallmark of containing teaching. Like, if we don't know our own being undone, kind of coming up against the constraint of my own beliefs and the feelings which root them so powerfully through the body, I'm going to get frustrated. And I own that as a teacher over the years in individual sessions and in groups, where my own bias, my implicit bias and sometimes explicit bias about somebody's religious beliefs comes screeching up against mine.
Yeah.
And of course that doesn't help. I might kind of put on the airs and graces of a teacher, but beneath the surface, I'm kind of like, I'm grumbling away to myself with a kind of level of self-righteousness, which I'm really good at, just by the way. And so that kind of reciprocity of knowing, of the willingness to continuously lean into and feel into and expand into our own self-awareness as teachers. Or let's say you're not teaching, just your own, because everybody's a teacher if you're not teaching, just by virtue of being alive and being awake. We encounter and sense and respond to all the people who we move through our life with, and that becomes teaching. So that knowing of that, and I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that I was so self-righteous. Like, that's a conviction based on a belief, based on a particular pattern, based on a particular way of coping, based on a particular way of feeling wounded in the world and injured and traumatized. So I think that the question is kind of folds back on itself for people with experience or who dedicated to the path. It keeps going, oh, well, I'm working with others, but how does that affect me? How is this expanding self-awareness bring itself to bear in my own undoing and becoming at the same time in ways that maximize my not maximize is maybe a too strong a word, enhance my capacity to meet people where they are with a genuine curiosity and willingness to, I see where you are. This is what's possible with this practice and this path, but it's you can choose to walk a little bit further along it or not. So what is my role in terms of my own practice? I'm curious. Does that land? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, Simon. And I think the word that comes to mind, of course, is transference. So, what you're talking about is what is the feeling that the participant evokes in you. And I think in working in group settings, particularly with individuals who may share very different and even fundamentalist or very conservative belief systems, but nonetheless come to an MBI for self-regulation, whatever they're looking for, we need to be acutely aware of our own countertransference and what that evokes in us. And to be mindful of that, because if we're not, we run the risk of being harmful or in our approach. And so being acutely aware of this, what even a question coming from a conservative religious person in a group evokes in us is so important, because if we can't hold that with compassion, then we really run the risk of alienating that individual or pushing them away, or perhaps pushing them into a corner. So I think this is important, because I think that many of us who've been in the mindfulness movement for many years are really very comfortable with the traditions, and we have developed to an extent our own subculture, our own language and way of speaking. And we need to be very sensitive in working with people coming at this from a, as I say, particularly a more fundamentalist or traditionalist view.
I also think that it's okay to say mindfulness isn't for everybody as a practice.
Yes.
That's a paradoxical statement, because awareness itself is that's always what I was trying to orientate us towards with that practice at the beginning. Where's awareness located? Then is it a personal I, or has it got another quality to it? So it's not for everybody. That is, not everybody is in a place where it's going to be helpful, valuable, useful in respect of their own journey. Yet, and this is where my self-righteousness I have to watch, yet there's a sense that from a particular perspective, their capacity for awareness is no different from mine. Because by virtue of being human.
Yes.
So the capacity to be with experience, be it the breath or the sensations in the feet against the floor, or being with the thoughts moving through the mind, or being with the feelings sitting in the chest, or being with another human being in the listening, being with the feeling of breeze on the skin. Like that quality is awareness. It's that quality of being with. So that's another doorway in here, Pete, is the shifting of, you bring up the issue of language, and to be really sensitive around language. So, we can use the word like awareness and mindfulness, and then we can potentially open the doorway to things Eastern. But East, West, North, South, it's all the same to awareness.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where you are. Baba Mandazu, who many of you would have met at the conference a few years ago, he says, I find it very strange that I have to get a visa to go to England to meet with myself, to be with myself. Why do I need a visa to go be with myself in England? And so he's pointing us in such a delightful way. It's like it's quite, we kind of hold that with a lightheartedness, is that you know, being where we are, however we are on a spectrum of conviction, if you will, of belief, of understanding, of perspective, is very, very interesting. And maybe I can just, can we loop back to the self-transcendence question, Pete, but not, can we just hold it for the moment? Because there's one of the other models that we wanted to introduce here, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is Ken Wilber's integral model. And he talks about quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, which are the, we can't go into here. Maybe that's its learning forum in and of itself, looking a little bit in more depth at the integral model. But think of the, he talks about states of consciousness, states of awareness. Sleep is a state, waking is a state, deep sleep and dreaming are different states. So we know states. You can get into an altered state through medication and through drugs. You can get into an altered state if you're furious. You can get in an altered state if you're sexually aroused. So the nature of a state is that it arises and then falls away in time. So it's in time. It starts. It has a duration, and then it ends. That's why it's a state. And then so there are many different states. And so we can have, especially as it relates to matter spiritual, we can talk about non-ordinary states or altered states. I prefer non-ordinary states. And then he talks about stages, which is a very potentially tricky territory, because stages are an evolution of waves of expanding sense of identity. And it occurs at an individual level, it occurs at a cultural level, it occurs at a biological level, it occurs at a systemic level. So let me give you an example. A letter becomes a word, becomes a sentence, becomes a paragraph, becomes a page, becomes a chapter, becomes a novel. A subatomic particle evolves into an atom, which evolves into a molecule, which evolves into a cell, which evolves into a multicellular organism, which evolves into organs, which evolves into multi-organ systems, which evolve into complex multi-organ systems, and so forth. Now, would you say a novel is better than a letter? We never say that. It was like, no, the novel looks at the letter, go, you pathetic little letter, I'm a novel, so, and the complex brain doesn't look at the atom, go, you piffly little subatomic quark. It doesn't, in nature, there's none of that kind of hierarchy of better. So it's always good to look at that progression evolutionarily from stages. And the same is true of cultures. The ancient ancestors were hunter-gatherers, and then they became agrarian, and then farmers and agrarian and so forth. Now in an informational age, there has been an evolution, and there continues to be. But what is so powerful about this model is that we need the subatomic reality to become the atomic reality, become the molecular reality, to become the cellular, and so forth. We include that which is at one level to transcend to the more complex level above it. It's not better. Mm-hmm. It's not better. And it's like, forgive my, I'll show my age here. Oh, I see, Mike, you've gone into load shedding. It's like I'm seeing lights go off. Lights are meant to come on, we're talking about matter spiritual. So when the lights go off, so when I completed standard 4 and went to standard 5, I didn't ditch the entirety of my primary school education. I included everything I'd learned in standard 4 and then went to standard 5. And so on through the progression of the learning process. So Wilbur calls this include and transcend.
Mm. Mm.
The so-called lower levels, the problem with language is lower. I hear low, and then higher is better. So that's why I wanted to give you this, like, we include the lower levels, and then we transcend to the next level. We don't, when we the alternative, which is the shadow version of this model, the devolution model, is exclude and transcend. It's moving thing, and this is where we'll come back to this question, is like, especially when we talk about mindfulness and spirituality, and the psychological reality, so easy to, I'm going to transcend, but I'm going to exclude a whole lot of stuff that doesn't suit my model or my belief system. So I want to just loop, now that I'm kind of talking about sentences and lines and atoms and so forth, how does that relate to us as individuals? We can have different states of consciousness, but we can also have stages of development or waves of development. And Pete, just, obviously that you are, and coming back to your original questions, you ask, well, how would I respond to somebody who in the initial stages of either an individual or a group learning with mindfulness? I would try and sense, first of all, the state that I was in and the state that they were in and the state that the group were in present time. And engage intuitively and cognitively what stage of development or what stage of consciousness. If it was a more expanded stage, I would try and meet them there. And of course, if they're way beyond me, then of course I'd be sitting in their class. So that's also very, very helpful, because somebody who's got a very traditional belief system, to be rocking on about self-transcendence is just alienating.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
And they're not going to, and another, just I want to do, and I'm throwing in a number of different ideas here, so we can pick all of them up, and the group, I'm sure, will have things to say about that. But one of my favorite teachings from Wilbur is, he said, to imagine a wooden ladder with rungs on the ladder. So the stages of an individual consciousness, from pre-rational to rational to trans-rational, from pre-egoic to egoic and trans-egoic, from pre-verbal to verbal to trans-verbal, all this evolution are like the rungs on the ladder. And so there is a natural evolution, but if you look at that ladder, the whole ladder is still wood. So the availability of so there's a progression and an evolution at one level, and paradoxically, there's nowhere to go because you already would.
Mm. Mm.
And so it's really beautiful that, because if somebody's at a very, had a high level conviction about, say, as you raising this particular issue, like very traditional view on religion, and we're meeting them in a mindfulness-based setting, we can realize that irrespective of that level, it's still made from wood.
Mm.
And so there's value in that's why I like, it doesn't necessarily, they don't have to progress. They can be met there and actually equalize or integrate at that very level to a higher level, to a higher degree. In another metaphor, I think it was Wilbur said as well, all waves are equally wet.
Mm. Mm.
So I'm thinking that's maybe it's another model, if you want to riff on that a little, Pete.
Yeah. I'm glad you've raised that, Simon. I think Wilbur's work on stages is particularly useful, because no matter what religious or faith tradition participants come from, the stages are generic. And I think it is really helpful, as you say, to have a sense of where people are in terms of their stages. And it's usually very apparent, even by the questions that they ask from a religious perspective. I remember years ago, and this was for me pre-Ken Wilber, was coming across the work of James Fowler. Fowler was a Harvard theologian writing in the 1970s, and his book was called Stages of Faith. And very similar to Wilbur's work, he outlined from empiric research how people moved through these stages from initial egocentric spaces to more world-centric and ultimately more transcendent stages, really very much echoed by Wilbur's work and by many others. And I found that exceptionally helpful. And as you say, engaging with participants around this in a non-judgmental way. So we're not talking about it's better to be in one place or another. We're simply understanding where people are, and in understanding the stage, it really helps us to engage with them, particularly, I think, around issues of faith or religion or belief, and to do that in a non-judgmental way. It provides for me a really, really useful framework by which to do this.
Can we address the elephant in the room? For me, is what do, not so much religion, but when we use the word spirituality, I'm not even, that in and of itself has got so many meanings. And so I don't know if that's give the digital talking stick to you with that question attached to it.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the problems, isn't it? I think if we were to ask in this group, everyone would have a different response, and that's precisely the problem with the word, is it means very different things to different people. So I'm loath, in fact, to try and give a clever definition of spirituality, because I think that what's much more important here in teaching mindfulness is we understand what individual participants perceive as their own spirituality, rather than trying to define it in a generic way. And I mean, there are many. You just have to Google spirituality and mindfulness to find many people attempting to put this into words, but I don't think it's particularly helpful. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, it probably isn't in most contexts. In this context, with this group of people, it might be one of those places where we could gently lean into it a little bit. And it was interesting. I was it last year? I can't quite remember. Maybe it was, last year I was running a retreat, and a 3-day retreat, and something arose in the group, and it's still not exactly clear to me what it was, but where I found myself is with a growing sense of a yearning to reintegrate some quality of spirit into my mindfulness practice, because I've been so steadfastly doing exactly what you've counseling, Pete, and I myself have counseled others to do when teaching, is to keep it simple, to meet people where they are, to focus on the self-regulation and self-awareness. And what became apparent to me was there was a little niggling cost to my own evolution, my own growth, my own healing, my own becoming, if you will. So I know this isn't strictly on topic, Pete, and it's not exactly, what would we do in the class, but it feels personally poignant, should I say. And I suspect that I've spoken to quite a few people. There is that, it's a kind of, let's call it a spiritual intuition or a yearning. And there was a moment, and I had a conversation with the group, and one woman in particular there was a sense of, is there, this is what you're talking about, what we're talking about is skillful means as a teacher, no question. So again, not to exclude and transcend at all, or to say this is better. I'm talking about, for some in this group who are here this evening, and for myself, at a level, there's a kind of a yearning for something which doesn't feel like there's a kind of sterilizing copy-paste quality to teaching mindfulness.
Yes.
And there is something implicit in the felt sense of being aware and awake in the present moment, which is mysterious.
Yes.
Which doesn't lend itself to it lends itself to a model at one level and to explanations and skillful means of teaching. But in and of itself, the very direct knowing itself feels somewhat mysterious.
Yes. I think this is actually highly relevant to this discussion, Simon, because I think this was part of my own experience in coming to mindfulness, but something that's come up many times from participants is, and particularly those that emerge from perhaps a theistic religious tradition, is they drop into mindfulness or MBSR, engage with it, find it helpful at a self-regulatory level. But I've often heard this comment, and it's interesting that they use exactly the word that you've used. It's sterile. And what they're really asking is, where is the divine in this? Where is the mystery? Where is that special quality? And I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a danger, particularly if we use a kind of recipe-based approach, or perhaps we're too zealous in making our mindful teaching non-traditional, non-aligned, if I can use that word, that it just becomes sterile.
Mm.
And so one of the challenges and one of the conversations I think we're going to have in the next few learning forums, as we explore different aspects of religion and spirituality, is reconnecting with this numinous quality of presence, and I'll use the word divine presence, in the process, and in so doing, taking, if I could say, the sterility out of the mindfulness practice, but holding still true to being present, and all that means. And to put that in very pragmatic language, I found with some, particularly in individual work, that, I mean, of course, what goes without saying, and I think everyone here would know this, that all the great religious or spiritual traditions have contemplative or meditative branches to them, albeit often in the minority, but they're there, and they're there to be found through the ages, whether you're looking at Christian mysticism or other traditions. And sometimes for people, this can be really helpful, because many of these individuals, through the stages of faith or stages of consciousness, have kind of grown out of a particular religious position, come perhaps to mindfulness. And it's often very healing for them to reconnect, and discover that within their own tradition, there is a more transcendent space or a more transcendent stream. And that can be wonderfully healing and holistic. And I find just in pragmatic conversations with people who are kind of asking these questions, that it's really helpful to have some knowledge of the traditions. So you can point people to particular authors or books that may be helpful. And in fact, I'm hoping that some of the discussions, as I say, in the next couple of learning forums will give those in this group some useful material to do that, because I think bridging this gap is such an important thing in our process as teachers.
I don't think Jan is online at the moment. Jan, are you here? I'm going to steal your thunder, if I may. Even I know you, hopefully you'll watch this later, Jan, but I would have asked you to tell the story. But I'm going to tell the story. So Jan is, I'm sure he won't mind my sharing the story. It's just so exquisite. Jan is a dominee in the NG Kerk lineage. And he was teaching MBSR a couple of years ago. And he described to me his first session of MBSR. It was a standard MBSR. He put a candle in the center of the room. Everybody came in and there was silence, which is, you know, for those of you teacher, I don't know my experience of teaching, everybody's so anxious. I'm anxious and I'm trying to like make everybody settled, and I'm chatting and getting them tea and, you know, settling them, shining them in and giving them and he just like, it's like in silence. So everybody came in and there was a candle in the room, in silence. The first thing. And then he said, I'm going to tell you about a line in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, when Moses was standing in front of the burning bush. And Moses was asked to take off his sandals. And it's a whole, obviously lots of line, but he dropped in the word in Hebrew, which was the original language of the Old Testament. The word is hineni. Here I am, or I am here. Hine is here in Hebrew, and ani is me or I. Hineni makes it one word. Hineni. Hineni. I am here, or I am, comma, here now is another way of expanding it. Hineni from the Old Testament. And he said, by way of introduction to each other, we're going to do 3 rounds. And you can either say, I am here, or I see you, Pete, you are here, or I sense this whole group, we are here. In English, not in Hebrew or Sanskrit or Swahili or anything. It happened to be, actually it might have been Afrikaans, because Jan is an Afrikaans speaker, and his group was Afrikaans speaking. And they did 3 rounds of I am here, you are here, we are here. Depending on what moved through each individual. That was how I started MBSR. Would never find that in a manualized version of MBSR. That I promise you, ever. But in that, for me, it's one of the most exquisite examples of context-sensitive adaptation while staying true to the ethic and ethos of the process and the integrity of the approach, and not making it sterile. Really, I wish you were here, Jan, so I could just honor you in person. But if you're listening, I'm doing it now. I'm sure many of you have done similar things. I'm just using that as a particular embodied example of taking a traditional view and expanding it through skillful means, through the quality of presence, creativity, honoring of tradition, and crucially of the seeing of other. There's the other element here. It's like, if we do this in isolation, then there can be no, whether we call it religion or spirituality, if it's divine isolation, Pete, then it ain't divine. I suspect. So there's something, and that's a whole nother element here of the experience of the collective, of the community, of relationality, of seeing and feeling seen by another or by the group, which carries it with it a hineni quality to it. It brings something else into play. And that doesn't need any words. You can use it. It doesn't need explanation. It's direct experience, direct apperception. And so so there is that beauty of each individual going out into the world and offering a mindfulness X, Y, or Z, with individuals or with groups. It doesn't matter. But an opportunity through your own unique state and stage to invite, to remember, and to recognize that quality that is always already available. And I think that that's one of the things about the wooden ladder. The wood is always already available. The waves and the ocean are all equally wet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you, Simon. And that's a wonderful example. Yeah, I'm just conscious of time and would love to open this conversation to the wisdom of the group, because I'm sure many who like to contribute to the discussion. I wondered though if I could just read a short passage from Mark Williams, because I think Mark, in a way, would have been ideal in a conversation like this. Many of us know Mark well as a mindfulness teacher. He's been a wonderful mentor and friend to Misa over the years, but he also doubles not only as, now retired professor of psychology at Oxford, but an honorary canon in the Oxford Cathedral. So he straddles mindfulness and religion and spirituality in a very interesting way. And I thought I'd just read what he said. He said this, he said, words, whether they are spoken or thought or written, present us with a world of ideas that are so good at representing reality that we unwittingly use them as a stand-in for actual experience. Religion is not immune to this. Awareness of a presence or power in the universe and the deep silence from which it originates soon gives way to words about the experience. So we move from poetry to prose, from a glimmer of understanding to the harsher light of dogma, and from a celebration of openness to a perceived need to defend closed positions. We become so preoccupied with finding the meaning of life that we lose touch with the experience of being alive. Mindfulness can nourish and renew faith. Through regular meditation practice, we find that mindfulness transforms our lives, brings a sense of peace, of having more time, of being less hectic. Mindfulness allows us to turn towards what we fear with greater courage and open-heartedness, and to be released for loving action in the world. So thank you, Simon. I'd love to provide an opportunity for others to contribute to this discussion. So please do feel free to share anything that you'd like to. We would love to hear your wisdom.
Peter, can I say something?
Yes, thanks, Bianca. You go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just writing some notes as you were talking, and something that struck me, and it kind of came full circle with what you've shared now by Mark, is that initially when you were talking about how sometimes when participants begin to recognize their thoughts as simply thoughts, that this can invoke perhaps some sense of fear in them around their religious beliefs. But at the same time, it also offers space to move to a more felt sense of their religious beliefs. And so maybe that, when you spoke about the divine, you used the word divine, but it's almost like that felt sense of their beliefs in their body can strengthen their faith to some degree. And then Simon mentioned about with that possibly becoming undone. But maybe it can also be looked at as coming home. So like moving out of the thoughts and seeing their beliefs just as thoughts, rather feeling them internally and like really getting a sense of coming home. So I've just come across a bit of that in my experience, where it's deepened somebody's faith to move out of their thoughts and into the felt sense of what they believe.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Bianca. Absolutely. So the movement is from believing or knowing to being, isn't it? Mm. Thank you.
Thanks, Bianca.
Pete and Simon, is everybody seeing my hand? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much for that. Loved your presentations and your deep sense of embodying, what it is that you're trying to communicate. But Pete, I really loved your quote of Mark Williams. And I've met him twice, once when he taught mindfulness-based CBT in Cape Town, and Simon a few years ago at the conference that they had up in Gauteng. And if I've ever met somebody that actually, whose behavior and interaction actually embodies whatever he's actually said, you can learn much from an MBSR course, the content and the form, etc. But to actually meet somebody that actually, embodies, the presence that I can only describe as a loving, beautiful, communication. It's something that has deeply touched me, and it's something that I would actually love to spend more time in his presence, because he embodies whatever it is that he's teaching. So thank you for that quote, and it just reminded me of that. I also like to share that about a year ago, I experienced something that I can only call, for me, was a very deep mystical experience. People in my family actually thought that I was losing it. And my family advised me to speak to a psychologist, and there were moments when I thought that I was actually becoming a little bit manic, to be honest. I won't go into the details, but what two things that actually stood out for me was, one was an amazing experience of synchronicity, which I was personally, meaningful and valuable to me. And the second thing that actually stood out in my experience was this overwhelming feeling of love and connection that I had. That kind of convinced that it was much more than a kind of meltdown or breakdown. The stillness that we experience, there is something mystical about it. And Pete, you probably know more about the collective unconscious and the work of Jung. But there is a mystery to that, that I, on a very personal level, kind of experienced, that removed a lot of the sterility of what it means to quieten down, to become present, embodied, and still. So there is something there. I would just say, watch that space, or watch this.
Watch the spaciousness.
Watch the spaciousness. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Srini.
Thanks, Srini. Thank you for that.
There is a quality that, this loving quality that you refer to, which is transverbal, which it doesn't require words. It's felt, as you say, Bianca. There's like a felt sense of some quality of, you can give it words like connection, care, love, empathy, feeling part of, which are available readily, that more likely to be experienced if we show up with presence, if we're paying attention. And this is another beautiful link, is like these kind of moments, it's not like, wow, the heavens open up and the clap of lightning and thunder and I'm taken up into the right hand of God. It doesn't have to be that. It's just that momentary smile from the barista at Woolworths. And there's this moment of seeing, and it's like, wow, two human beings meeting each other in the most simple way. It's just like a subtle sense of opening and connection. And it's right there, that it's so easy to miss if I'm lost in thought. So yeah, I love, so what you say, the love can be also, it can be this like, wow, unconditional love, but it can be the simple love of warm human connection in any given moment that we are available for by virtue of practice. And the obstacle to practice is being lost in thought without knowing or having awareness that I'm lost in thought. And then, as you say, Bianca, there's no possibility of embodying any quality in which there's more of a felt sense of myself, and as such, more of a felt sense of you. And in that shared feeling is the connection, not in the shared thought. So it's a wonderfully giddy making complex puzzle that is like, we string it together. Oh, I get a glimpse of it, and then it all disappears in the next moment. But yeah, thanks for that, Srini. That's what comes to mind.
Thank you, Alex, for your comment I see in the chat. Somehow for me, this talk came full circle now, from alienation to presencing to trust. Simple, full trust. Thank you.
Maybe something from my side. I'm Emmanuel Van Tonder. I moved to the USA about a year ago. I'm a pastor and started presenting mindfulness courses here. And after 3 months, journalists came to see me and they said, they want to write an article. I said, okay, I can't say no, so let's do it. So the article came out with the following heading, and you can Google it. It's South African pastor, and we say pastor here and many other different ways of using English. South African pastor teaches Buddhist skills to Clifton Park congregation. And it's into the Times Union. That's the biggest newspaper in this is the capital city of New York, so Albany. So you can just imagine how worried I was. You know, I thought I'm going to be packing everything. I'm going to go all the way back to South Africa and crying in front of Simon's door. And you know what? The interesting thing is that I had not one, and I really can say not one negative or kind of feedback that people did not actually grow into mindfulness and were attracted to mindfulness. I think it also depends on how we communicate it. What I've found is people do have perceptions and expectations, and if you can address those perceptions and expectations in a really meaningful and an honest way, people really do feel attracted, and they find a lot of value in it. For myself, and the only process that I use in spiritual context, I do make a lot of an introduction. So I do invite people to either come to an hour introduction, or I have online introductions in Afrikaans. I also have a 6-week, it's all online, so one can do it for free. 6 weeks Afrikaans mindfulness intermediate. So before you come to the MBSR, they do have a better view of mindfulness, at least. And I think that creates an opening for you for whatever religion they are in. I also present the mindfulness without any a specific religious background. So in the sense of anybody who wants to join is welcome, and without being pushed into any religious group. So actually, speaking of that, the word religion, ligare, is rebind, reconnect. So it actually should be reconnecting. Even the Oxford definition of spirituality is a quality of being connected. So there are ways that one can also work with these things. And as you said, many of the traditions that we are using in our Christian traditions are also in the mindfulness tradition. Silence, awareness, the relativity of thoughts and emotions, it's full in the Christian tradition. Meditation, even emptiness. If you that's such a beauty in the concept of emptiness in theology. It's interesting, the resonance that you find. If you read Rumi, it's just, so what? Oh, that's exactly what I think, and that's exactly what I believe. So it's yeah, I think I should stop, but I feel like there's a resonance and a deep connection that if people really just open to the possibility of the connectedness, the interconnectedness across cultural and linguistical and concept boundaries, there is a deep growth and possibility of thriving. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
What intrigues me most is the number of Afrikaans speakers in New York, Emmanuel, that you're running MBIs for in Afrikaans in New York. But how do you present in your introduction? What is that? Do you avoid Buddhism and talk about the Buddha? Do you just talk about like the universality of mindfulness, and especially when you're introducing it in a religious / spiritual context of the church? What are some of the skillful means that you've learned over the years that really support that? So the endpoint or the felt sense, to take Bianca's word again, is of interconnectedness. But if you're framing as an introduction to potentially learning mindfulness, what are some of the skillful means that you are using?
I think one of the core concepts that I really resonated with is in Shapiro's work, referring to mindfulness as kindfulness. The concept of mindfulness as presence and compassion. And seeing that as the core. I call it the two wings of mindfulness. I think they also use that word, if I'm not mistaken. And working from that as the core and saying, well, okay, this does have different areas where you can find it. Mysticism can be found in Buddhism, and I'm going to share a lot of that today. That's got Buddhist roots, but you will also find it in the Islam with Rumi, and I'm going to use some of Rumi's prayers. Actually, the word mysticism means, actually, if you go to the dictionary, it's seeing the divine in everything. So it's opening up to a new world. So I do refer to the Buddhist roots, but I also been exposed to so many roots in the Christian tradition. But when I present it to a group that's not in the church, I do try to focus a lot on the scientific background. I do fall back on the studies that we did, and it really opens up a new world. I made a summary of most of what we've been taught, and use that as the basis. So using good science, I think that is very, very important.
Yeah, it's just wonderful. So helpful as well, in a kind of really grounded, practical and real world way that, and maybe that's something we didn't mention that you just embodied and named so beautifully, is to recognize the implicit kindness of the practice itself. Kindness, compassion for self and other is, if we in every religion there will be, unless one is virulently and violently anti everything, there will be resonance. which is what I think what you're saying. And it's that resonance with care, kindness, empathy, love, without being gushy and saying, well, this is that. You know, Jack Cornfield talks about mindfulness as loving awareness. Isn't that a beautiful phrase? Loving awareness. Not loving kindness as a practice, but mindfulness itself, the kindfulness that you refer to as loving awareness. I think once we start getting into that quality, that resonance of languaging, which is about relationality, care for self and other, kindfulness, kindness, then perhaps there is a certain transcendence to that language that does bind together rather than alienate and separate it. Thank you for that wonderful insight, Emmanuel. Really wonderful.
Thank you.
We got time, I think, for one more reflection.
So something that just sort of stood out for me as you were both talking was how the attitudes of mindfulness and our presence as teachers will also have such a huge impact in how we handle the questions that come up in the mindfulness classes. And so there's something for me about just returning to those roots, those attitudes as a way of dealing with questions that might come up and fears that participants in the class might have around how this is going to impact on my own personal beliefs and spiritual tradition.
Yeah, thanks for that, Liz. You know, as in any group process, holding that safe space for participants is just essential. So thank you.
Okay, so we one more, or should we close it there, Pete? We've got 2 minutes. You want to give a final kind of reflection?
Yeah, thanks, Janine. I think we're at our advertised close, so maybe we should end it here. I don't want to miss Bianca's input in the chat from Rumi. I think it's a wonderful line to end on. So beneath the ideas of right and wrong, there is a field. I will meet you there. Thank you. And thanks everybody for your participation. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sam.
Night, night.